Hi, Alan Stratton from As Wood Turns. A while ago, a friend gave me a chunk of birch wood. I thought, oh great, okay, I'll wet turn this and then turn it into a bowl. But birch is fairly blond. So, okay, well, it'll do. So I rough turned it, soaked it out in alcohol overnight to expedite the drying process, put it in a paper bag to dry, and then got involved in the Christmas ornament wood turning challenge, and it stayed a little bit longer than it probably needed to in the bag drying. In the end, it lost over 30% of its weight just in the drying process between rough turned and when I started to turn. Then, when I turned it, I turned out another 50% of its then weight. Now, I said it was blonde to begin with, but look at how this bowl has turned out with the different staining and coloration that's in the grain. I'm really tickled pink with how this has turned out. So let's make a birch bowl, but always remember your face shield.
I rough turned this bowl last summer from fresh, wet birch. To expedite drying the wood, I soaked it for a day in alcohol, then placed it in a brown paper bag to dry. It has lost over 1/3 of its original weight and should be very dry. My first intent was to invert the rough bowl onto a chuck or faceplate, but the bowl is too deep. It would have rubbed on the tailstock. Fortunately, most of my threaded wood faceplates also have a tenon for them to mount to a chuck. So I mounted a wood faceplate to the chuck, inverted the bowl onto the faceplate, and held it in position with the tailstock. Then I started to trim up the tenon first, in case I would need to remount it more securely quickly. Then carefully work the exterior of the bowl with a combination of push cuts, pull cuts, and shear scraping. In contrast to when I rough turned the bowl, the wood is now very hard, but this birch tools nicely. I'm not getting a lot of tear out. With the exterior reshaped, I'll power sand the exterior now, starting with 80 grit. Last week, I had a discussion with my neighbor who is restoring an old Ford pickup. He had block sanded his bodywork on a fender with 180 grit and then reprimed the fender, then sanded again with 600 grit, aiming for a very smooth finish. He was amazed when I showed him the deep scratches despite his sanding with 600 grit. He thought he was getting a very fine surface. In fact, he was working very hard, but leaving the nasty scratches anyway. He did not understand that any shaping is done with the coarse grit. After that, the job of each succeeding grit is to remove the scratches left by the previous grit. We as woodworkers have the same situation with scratches in our wood projects. This birch is sanding out very nicely. Now it's time to reverse the bowl and mount it onto the chuck so that I can trim up the interior. I'll start the interior with a gouge. This bowl is quite deep, so it's hard to go after the bowl's bottom. I switched to a steeper ground gouge, but still got a lot of chatter. So I switched to using a large bowl scraper for the bottom and a smaller round nose scraper for what little remained to do on the sides. Then power sand the interior. I use an air-powered sander. It's smaller and lighter than an electric sander, but with the compressor running, it's at least as noisy. Here I sanded the end grain with the lathe stopped, then went over it again with the lathe running. This was only for the 80 grit pass. To turn the foot, I decided to try my vacuum chuck. My initial test had it holding quite well, but I still secured it with the tailstock while I cut off the tenon and made a shallow recess in the foot. But then, with the tailstock removed, the bowl shifted. Between a loose O-ring and the weight of this bowl, it is not secure enough to tool with just a vacuum chuck. So I switched to my homemade coal jaws for that little bit of last tooling and sanding. To finish, I soaked the entire bowl in walnut oil overnight, then wiped out the remaining oil after it had drained. I'm pleasantly surprised about how nice this bowl looks. Despite the mostly light-colored grain, there's a lot of variety of grain color and natural staining. The birch sanded out very nicely. Once the walnut oil cures, I'll probably buff this bowl and see how much it improves the look. If you have not already subscribed, please subscribe to both my website and YouTube channel. Always wear your face shield. Until next time, this is Alan Stratton from As Wood Turns.